Welcome everyone. Today we're going to talk about a SOC 2 single framework strategy and how one can integrate SOC 2 into a single framework strategy. Before we get started, I should acknowledge this is May 4th, so may the 4th be with you if you're a Star Wars fan. Had to say that. But let's get started. Here's our agenda for today. We're going to begin with a little background and overview to give some context, and then we're going to talk through a 4-step process that builds upon each other for integrating SOC 2 into a single framework strategy. We'll do a brief recap just to make sure we touch on those key points again, and then we'll talk about the downloads that are available with this presentation. All right, so let's begin with the background and framing the problem. So if you're in the security compliance space, you're probably very familiar with the following problem. Large and growing companies are increasingly having to deal with a lot of complexity because there's a lot of different needs of the organization. There's a lot of different regulatory frameworks and certification schemes that the market both recognizes that sales might be asking for or customers are demanding. And here's a kind of a list of a lot of the alphabet soup that you might see in the space. You know, ISO 27001 is a big one. There's other ISO frameworks that cover different things that are important. Obviously, the SOC framework and sort of compliance scheme. You have HITRUST, PCI, you name it. There's a lot. So you consider that a lot of organizations today are probably doing at least one or more of these, and when you start stacking on additional compliance requirements, it's very easy for an organization to be in audit mode throughout the entire year. So one of the things that we like to talk about at Risk 360 is single framework strategy, or how do you condense the activities and the efforts into either a single audit or a reduced number of audits to save people headaches, to focus on the mission of the company, to reduce costs and have a much more streamlined approach to this. So that's what we're going to get into. For SOC 2, for those that might not be as familiar with this, SOC 2 is governed by the AICPA. That's the American Institute of CPAs here in the US. So they define the actual framework, which is a set of criteria called the Trust Services Criteria. But there's flexibility with SOC 2 in that the controls are not defined. It's left up to the organization that is building their SOC 2 program to define those controls. Often that process of designing the controls is done with the audit firm that an organization might be using. Examinations for SOC 2 are done by CPA firms. You have to be a CPA firm to examine and issue reports and the audit opinion for SOC 2. We do that here at Risk 360. And then there are 2 types of examinations. There's a type 1 exam, which is a point-in-time assessment over the design of control and fairness of presentation of the information system. And then there's type 2, which is really the gold standard for SOC 2 reporting, which covers, in addition to the design of controls and fairness of presentation, also covers the operating effectiveness of controls over time. And that's really what customers are wanting to see with SOC 2. They want to understand that, yes, you have a program in place that addresses key security themes and categories, but also those controls have operated effectively over a period of time. And that's where really the value is. There's additional trust service categories that some firms choose to add. A lot of times it's based on industry or based on the services that they're providing. And those 4 are listed there. So just one more thing on background, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So what is the opportunity when integrating SOC 2 into a single framework strategy? Why would we do this? Well, the bottom line up front, it allows companies to operate a better program. like I mentioned, the continuous audit whack-a-mole throughout the year really does slow down the organization. I mean, you think about the audit support that is necessary from a staffing perspective. You think about the back and forth on collecting evidence. You think about the number of walkthroughs that have to be done and redone. It really can be burdensome. Program costs, we're in 2023 and cost containment is really a theme for this year for a lot of companies who are either reducing headcount or trying to reduce costs. And integrating SOC 2 into an existing program really does help to save on costs, as we'll talk about a little bit later. Also, avoiding diverting focus. Focus is a big thing in business. The business has core business objectives they're trying to achieve, and anything that is not related to that or directly in support of that is going to come with an opportunity cost. Also, managing the complexity with a single framework strategy, that complexity can be reduced. And then the ability to audit once, report many. When that is achievable, that is a much better experience for all parties involved. All right, so without further ado, let's get started with step 1. All right, so we started here with defining the needs of the organization. I think in order to have a strategy, in order to integrate SOC 2 into a program, first we need to understand, all right, where's the organization at today? And also, where are they going to go in the future? Because every organization that is not growing is in trouble, and growing organizations have emerging needs. So I think it's important to understand both needs of the organization today and based on the strategic vision of the company, where's the company going and can we anticipate some of those upcoming needs? All right, so let's go ahead and build this slide. So as far as gaining context of the organization, it's important to understand the organizational structure. It's important to understand the company's positioning, both domestically and internationally. Maybe a company's been serving domestic clients to date, but maybe they're poised to go and expand internationally, which will have an impact on different compliance requirements. So it's good to know those things, or at least on the roadmap. Any kind of M&A activities that can affect a compliance, security and compliance program, because if you're having to fold organizations in or divest of organizations, that'll have an impact to the program for sure. Then market norms and requirements. So what are customers asking for? What are the market demands? And the way to really understand that, I think, is by getting with multiple stakeholders and departments. So first, it's understanding the strategic vision from leadership, but it's also talking to sales and marketing, because they have a lot of knowledge and context into the industry, what customers are asking, what the demands of the market are. It's also important to talk to product owners, because they have their own set of needs and they have a perspective that is unique. So I think they should be included in seeking to understand the context of the organization. Also customer success. They're constantly talking to customers, solving problems. They've got their ear to the ground. They're hearing things that some of these other departments are not. So to get a well-rounded view, I think it's important to engage with them as well. And the goal of all this is to create that common operating picture across the security and compliance landscape. And this is important when we start building the business case for making changes. So kind of where we're going today is, there's a process to integrating SOC 2 successfully, and these steps build, and I'll kind of recap at the end how they all tie together. But in order to have that common operating picture, we need to understand the context today and tomorrow. All right, step 2, we need to understand the current cost structure. And why is this important? Because along with building the business case for driving change, the change of integrating SOC 2 into an existing program, we also are going to need to build a ROI calculator. We're going to need to be able to describe what the cost savings are to the organization by championing this initiative. So what we have listed here are just kind of a handful of fees that you can associate with almost any security and compliance program. When you're doing compliance activities, there's going to be personnel costs involved, and those personnel costs are not just the cost of those that are facilitating from an internal perspective. It's also those whose time is required. There's audit support costs, program assessment fees, etc. So you can see, I mean, this probably isn't even comprehensive, but this kind of gives a good overview of how you can think about that. In the downloadable ROI calculator, we use that in-house, Everest 360, for championing different initiatives and thinking through, what is the business case for this? What is the return on investment? So we've repurposed that for SOC 2 to give you kind of a head start on, how you can think about these different costs and then how you can think about the benefit of moving forward with integrating SOC 2. All right, step 3. This is where we get into some of the meat and potatoes. So stay with me. We'll recap this at the end, but there's a lot of good steps here. And this is really important to make sure that you have a good strategy. So what I'll do is I'll build this slide. There's a few steps here, and then each of these steps kind of have their own slide that we'll talk about. So first is defining SOC 2 scope, and there's a few unique approaches that companies can take with this that I think is helpful to understand. So we'll talk about that. And then once you have a scope, how do you integrate that scope into an existing program or programs? We'll talk about different ways to think about that. Then we'll talk about streamlining, combining, and reducing ultimately the number of audits, the number of controls, and the number of evidence requests. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about automation and opportunities for that to reduce some of the efforts involved. All right, so how do we think about scope for SOC 2? So like I mentioned, SOC 2 is a flexible reporting framework. The controls are not defined, which allows us to marry those with other frameworks that may already exist at the organization to reduce the overall number of net new controls. So when we think about scope, there's really 5 things to think about for defining your SOC 2 scope. The SOC 2 scope is really the scope of an information system, and what that information system is made up of are these 5 elements. There's infrastructure, there's software, there's data, there's people, and there are processes. And now you say, okay, well, I could draw a box around that, but how should I think about that? What are different examples of scope? Well, it could be an entire company. So for smaller companies, for high growth tech startups, it might be the entire company that is included in the scope of that SOC 2. For larger organizations, maybe it's the division of a company, and maybe it makes sense for different divisions to have their own compliance requirements based on the markets that they're in, the clients that they serve. Additionally, it could be a business unit within a division. So it's really how you think about the use case of the SOC 2 report, why you're being asked to get it. That'll help kind of determine how you might define the scope and how you want to bracket that scope. The following are a few options to consider. So in option 1, you might try to reduce effort and burden by combining all scopes under a single SOC 2 report. That is sometimes helpful because it does streamline effort and timeline, and you're only testing everything once across the scope. So sometimes that is a little bit easier to manage, but sometimes that's not a good fit. And sometimes a better fit based on the different use cases of the report or the different ways that the company wants to go to market with the report is to have distinct ones based on products. So a common thing that we see is, if you're taking that approach where you have multiple reports, you might have shared services such as IT, human resources, and some other areas where there are shared services across the organization. Those shared services are relied upon by the different product teams. So sometimes a company might choose to get a report over their shared services and then individual ones based on the product. And then in option 3, sometimes it makes sense to keep all the reports separate, and a good use case or example of that is when the company's engaged in a lot of M&A activity. So you can consider, in that case, it's hard to integrate, shared services, or it might be cost prohibitive, or even just slow down the organization. And for different reasons, they might choose to keep that distinct and separate, siloed. In those cases, it makes sense to keep the reports distinct. All right, so then how do we think about integrating each scope into an existing program? Because based on how the company's SOC program is designed, there might need to be several reports or one. So let's just take an example of one and see how we might do that. So the first thing we want to do is define the existing program that the company has. So maybe it's a program based on ISO 27001. Maybe it's a program based on NIST CSF. Whatever it might be, we want to first understand what are all the compliance initiatives that are currently being done, and what are some of the regulatory factors to consider. Then we want to assess the overlap among these requirements. And as we build the slide, there'll be a diagram at the bottom that kind of shows a depiction of this. So you consider, if a company is doing HITRUST, if they're doing SOC 2, if they're doing ISO 27001, there's probably a lot of overlap among those different frameworks. And it might be nuanced to where they're saying the same thing in slightly different ways, which can be a little bit complex or confusing, but at the end of the day, they're asking to see the same thing. And that's where we can reduce some of that complexity for the benefit of the organization. All right, the next thing we want to do is customize that SOC 2 control set. So if we understand the compliance initiatives that the organization is facing, if we understand the landscape of compliance requirements, then we can see how best to customize the SOC 2 control set based upon whatever the preferred base framework is for an organization. So if an organization has an ISMS, they really like the structure of ISO 27001 with the governance and then the control sets. They might say, all right, let's go ahead and build a custom SOC 2 control set based on ISO. That makes a lot of sense. There's a good bit of overlap. In instances where the company is also doing HITRUST, there's also a lot of overlap between HITRUST and SOC 2. So I like to begin with, what is the preferred framework that the organization most recognizes? Let's build the custom control set to overlap as much as possible. And then there might be a subset of unique SOC 2 controls that are beyond the scope of that preferred framework, where you will end up with a set of net new controls, but it won't be a full set of net new SOC 2 controls. So like we mentioned, we want to reduce the number of unique SOC 2 controls. So basically, we're just reducing the net new requirements related to SOC 2 as we integrate SOC 2 into existing frameworks. So as an example here, I've kind of showed, there's a 30 to 40% overlap between SOC 2 and ISO 27001. So when you're considering both of those frameworks together, and you build that SOC 2 control set based on ISO, you're basically getting credit for that amount where there is overlap. Let me just stay here for a second. What we'll see a little bit later on is this does kind of trickle down and translate into not only reduce number of controls to which you would then assign control owners, but also a lot of reduction in the evidence that must be provided. And so we'll talk about this when we talk in the next slide about streamlining, combining, and reducing. All right, so in this step, what we want to do is we have an understanding of what we're up against. We understand the landscape of the organization, the frameworks. We understand the primary framework that we want to fold SOC 2 into. So how do we streamline, combine, and reduce? Well, let's go ahead and build this and see what we got here. All right, so we want to use that single framework strategy. In this case, in the example I'm going to stick with is ISO 27001. We're going to use that as our baseline framework. We're going to go ahead and assign all controls to control owners. This is a key step that often gets overlooked, but it's something that I like to emphasize is if there's a control out there, there needs to be someone who is accountable for ensuring that control is operating effectively. Because that is the big thing with SOC 2 is making sure that control owners are operating controls effectively over time. So when it comes time for audit, it's just a matter of proving that they were doing what they were supposed to. But when there's not control owners, it comes up a lot where things get lost or there's different people that might be responsible, but ultimately nobody's accountable for owning that and making sure that it happens among those responsible, and that is a big problem. So in the instance when we are trying to reduce the number of audits, we really want to sync timelines and combine activities. So this is creating an audit plan for the year. If you know that you've got a SOC 2 audit, you know you have an internal audit requirement with ISO 27001, you know that you have a certification audit. A strategy is seeing how you can synchronize those activities in the best way and where there's opportunities to combine those activities. So that's both for internal and external audits. You want that on an annual audit plan, because ultimately we want to reduce the number of audits. We want to reduce the audit fatigue. We want to help the organization not have to focus so much on different audits throughout the year. So like I mentioned, I wanted to show kind of a picture of what this looks like in practice. So when you're engaged with HITRUST, when you're engaged with SOC 2, ISO 27001, each of these different frameworks has different numbers of controls and control areas associated with them. So for an R2 HITRUST validated assessment, you might be looking at an average of 300 controls. If you stack SOC 2 on that and you do that the next month, you're looking at another 80 controls. And then if you do ISO 27001 the next quarter, that's another 114 controls. But the irony here is that there's a lot of overlap among these three, and they can be done as a single audit. So when you do that, your net number of controls can be reduced. And in this case, the example I'm showing, in this case, SOC 2 is completely covered by HITRUST. ISO is partially covered, so you end up with only 325 controls versus what was originally 494. So that's a 35% reduction in effort for the team. That's also a reduction in effort for actually gathering that evidence and submitting that evidence. So instead of having to do that multiple times throughout the year, that can just be done a single time. Just another example of what this looks like in practice. So we did this in-house because some of our clients do both ISO 27001 and SOC 2, and we wanted to see, okay, even though there's that 30 to 40% overlap, what does that actually look like in terms of reduction of evidence that we're requesting from clients? And as you can see here, there is a 53% reduction in evidence when we use a single framework strategy based on ISO 27001. So we were able to say, hey, these 53%, we're already requesting this for SOC 2. So there's no need to request this again. Our team can pull this within our platform. And so that's a big time and effort savings to an organization when they're having to do multiple audits. All right, let's talk about automation. So there's a lot of good stuff out there. For automation, I just want to clarify, you can't automate a SOC 2 as much as I would wish that for organizations. That is not possible, but it is possible to automate the evidence generation and collection, and that should be done when possible. And there's a lot of great tools out there, GRC tools that can help with this. We have an in-house GRC tool that we built over the last 5 years called Phalanx GRC. We have a cloud compliance management module that syncs with AWS that can ingest and pull a lot of evidence, which makes it a lot easier for our clients to submit evidence, and it makes it easier to audit that evidence. So I just recommend, if you're not thinking about automation, now is a great time to be thinking about it, because it is a big reduction on the team. Instead of having to go to engineering and get screenshots and pull lists, these things can be automated. All right, step 4. So we'll talk about step 4 and then we'll jump into the recap here. But step 4 is one of those areas that maybe involve a lot of soft skill, and so it doesn't get as much attention. But I think this is the whole key to successfully integrating SOC 2 into a single framework strategy or driving any positive change in an organization. And we want to start with the business case. Like I mentioned, steps 1 through 3 are really helping to get clarity in order to build and drive that business case. And we do have a download for an example business case that hopefully is helpful to you. Second is we want to calculate the ROI. If we can communicate the ROI of our strategy, it'll make a lot more sense to the stakeholders involved, and you're more likely to get buy-in. The third step would be to build consensus internally, and this really is key to driving positive change. I don't think people like to be surprised. And so if you can build consensus internally on, hey, this is the business case for why I think we should do this. This is the ROI of this strategy. And you start circulating that internally among different stakeholders. Now you have other people that are speaking the same thing as you are. They're championing the same initiative because they understand it and they're on board. So I like to identify, who are the internal champions? Even when we're doing change here as 360, it's like, okay, who else is on board? I see you're presenting this, but who else has seen this? I think it's very helpful when answering those types of questions. And who are your other advocates that need to be either consulted or informed? Building that internal consensus is so key to driving change. And then who's signing off on this initiative? Who has to approve it? Ultimately, if you can get a few champions who are also on the same sheet of music, if they're also talking about these things, and the person signing off has heard it a few times before they're actually presented with the pitch or the business case or the request for a decision, you're able to foreshadow that, and it's not the first time they're seeing it. So they've had an opportunity to digest it and kind of understand the why behind the initiative. And then lastly, increased communication. Whenever there's change in an organization, whenever there's an inflection point, increased communication is so necessary to making sure that everybody is rowing in the same direction. All right, so let's bring this back, kind of start from the beginning, bring it up to where we are, and hopefully this will help piece everything together for everyone. So we started with trying to talk through, wanted to understand, how do you integrate SOC 2 into a single framework strategy? How is this possible? What are some of the ways that this could be done? So we said there's really 4 steps that we want to talk about. First, we need to understand the needs of the organization today and in the future. We need that context. We also need to understand our current cost structure, because if integrating SOC 2 into a single framework strategy is not going to save us any costs, if it's not going to reduce any headache, it won't reduce the number of audits, number of controls, evidence, maybe it's not worth going down. But I think in most cases, there's a significant cost savings to be had, but we need to build that. We need to build that ROI calculator in order to communicate that effectively. Step 3, we want to craft that strategy from all the context and understanding that we have. We then want to take a look at, all right, what's the specific scope of our SOC 2 report? What are the different programs that we might be able to integrate this with that already exist? And that'll help us reduce the number of audits, reduce the number of controls, reduce the evidence that we're having to submit for those things, and that's going to save us a lot of time, which ends up reducing our cost. And then lastly, how do we automate evidence generation and collection? This is something we work with clients increasingly on because automation is so important. And this has to be really done at the control level to look at what is the control, what is the evidence that is being asked for us to submit, how can I automate this, or how can I reduce the burden on the team to submit this evidence? And then lastly, driving change. So we've gone through all this context in order to drive change. We've built the business case, we've got the ROI, we've built our champions internally, we've increased our communication, and now we're going to go ahead and get approval on this. All right, lastly, there's a few downloads that we've provided with this. Hopefully this is helpful to you. We have an associated white paper on this same topic that goes a little bit deeper into each of these steps. That is available. So is our business case for SOC 2, as is the SOC 2 ROI calculator. We also have some additional resources if you're looking to learn more about SOC 2 or some of our other offerings at Risk 360. You can check out our YouTube SOC 2 playlist. Hopefully that answers all your SOC 2 questions. We try to be pretty comprehensive with SOC 2. We also have a learning center on our website, as well as blogs on our website that kind of break down different nuances of SOC 2 as well. All right, I think that is it for my presentation. EJ, do we have any questions that we can answer for our audience?
Yeah, we had a couple in. Let's see, if I already have a SOC 2 Type 2, which other framework would you suggest? I'm looking for a very low effort one that we can showcase on our marketing materials.
I'd say it depends on the industry maybe, and it depends on the context of the organization. Because if you're looking for a low lift, maybe one of the lowest lifts out there right now is HITRUST E1. It is a new product offering from HITRUST. There's only 44 controls. Most likely your current SOC 2 scope covers it. So other than actually, going through the audit itself, there's not going to be much implementation effort on y'all's part. But one of the things we do in our single framework strategy approach, because we're a HITRUST external assessor, because we're a CPA firm, we can do that single audit where we issue the SOC 2 report, HITRUST issues the HITRUST certification, and that ends up being a very good experience for our clients because it's a single work stream with 2 reporting mechanisms that come out of that. So that's a pretty low level of effort. But HITRUST might not make sense for your industry. If you're more internationally focused, ISO 27001 is one of my favorite frameworks because it has strong governance. You have an ISMS. When you have strong governance in an organization, there's typically a lot better operating of controls. But that's not an insignificant lift. Even though there is that overlap, it is a new motion. So you're probably looking 6 to 12 months to implement that and achieve certification. And then beyond that, there are a lot of different things you could pursue. Again, I would, go back to the context of the organization, like who's expecting this from us? How is this going to help us? How do we plan on marketing it? Like if you're an organization that hasn't served healthcare before, but now you're getting into healthcare, HITRUST E1 makes a lot of sense. Low effort, speaks to healthcare, but it really depends. I would say PCI is another one, but PCI is really payment card industry specific, so that may not make sense. Hopefully that answered the question. EJ, you have any more out there?
Someone asked where can we locate the downloads?
The downloads should be in the GoToWebinar control panel under handouts.
Yeah, in the handouts, and also on our website at risk360.com. You can go to our resource center, and they're all in there under the white paper section. We also had, is there any software that allows us to easily map between frameworks?
Yes, there are. I don't have the names of all those, but I'd say some of the ones that are out there, like if you Google GRC tools, those are going to help you. There's some bespoke tools that I wouldn't consider GRC tools, but that can help with that. We do that in-house at Risk360 as well with Phalanx GRC. We have the ability to map frameworks or add frameworks to existing scopes. That's kind of one of our big initiatives this year, is just to make the interface for that a lot more clean. But this is kind of, I'd say within the last 2 to 3 years, this has become a much bigger thing. And I think the future of audit is to reduce this complexity to where you're operating a set of controls that is reflective of what your organization is doing and intends to do. And then on the back end, the audits fall out of that. So you can imagine just focusing on your program, doing the things you need to do. And when it comes time for auditing, the auditors are simply digesting the evidence that has been provided by virtue of operating those controls. So I think we're going to see a lot more automation, a lot better interfaces for doing multiple types of audits and compliance initiatives.
And then last one is, which framework overlaps the most with SOC 2?
It depends. The reason I would say that is if you're doing a HITRUST R2, basically covering all of SOC 2 with maybe a very small exception. Most R2 scopes are so large that it covers everything. So like when we do a HITRUST R2 plus a SOC 2, there's not much additional evidence required for SOC 2. It's almost completely an overlap, but it's also like an overlap plus a lot more. but that is a very good pairing. Again, we see SOC and ISO paired a lot, and the reason that that's paired is in the US, SOC 2 has a lot of strong recognition, especially for SaaS providers. But then if you go beyond the US and you start going international, their ISO 27001 is more of the recognized standard there. And there's a lot of European countries that are kind of coming out with their own cyber certification schemes. I know the European Union's working on one that's probably 3 to 5 years away. So yeah, it really depends on the use case for why you want to do it, as far as choosing additional frameworks. But as far as overlap, I'd say most frameworks, you're looking at least a 30% overlap, just because most certification schemes and reporting frameworks, they're covering the basics of cybersecurity and then some based on the specific use case. So PCI, requirement 12 is covering all the bases on, the basics of cybersecurity, but then you go into requirements 1 through 11 and it's very granular, but specific to cardholder data. And you look at, NIST and some others, it's like, they're largely saying the same thing, but maybe in a little bit different ways. So I'd say you have pretty much 30 to 40% coverage across the board.
Okay. Well, I think that's all we had. I'll go ahead and just remind everyone the handouts are in the GoToWebinar control panel. There's a little drop down that says handouts. It might be kind of hard to see for some people, so I just wanted to point that out, that all the documentation we talked about is in here in the control panel. And that's about all we've got for today.
Great. Thank you, everyone.